So, across your work, Taghut
Yes.
emerges as a key concept for understanding Zionism and U.S. empire. How does this Quranic anti-idolatrous insurgent concept clarify the theological stakes of war?
Thank you. Well, look, in 1492, several things happened, right? So Muslims and Jews in Spain were referred to as savages and heathens, savage being the racial, heathen being the religious identifier. We
Mhm.
were forcibly converted, we were murdered, we were persecuted, pillaged. And Ferdinand and Isabel, well, Columbus, who's a crusader, went to Ferdinand and Isabel because he had his eyes in Jerusalem. Remember, he grew in an environment in which he saw the loss of Jerusalem to Muslims, and he believed that the end times were going to happen within his lifetime, and he wanted to gather riches. So he convinced Ferdinand and Isabel that he would gather riches in order to fund the crusade and the reconquest of Jerusalem. Of course, he relied. Well, I'm not going to get into that, but he relied basically on Muslim astronomers and geographers, but he miscalculated his journey, particularly al-Biruni's work, and al-Farabi, actually. And anyways, he ended up reaching the shores of the Caribbean. The moment that he met the Taino people, he referred to them as savages and heathens, right? He described them as savages and heathens. Of course, you see the mimicry of this with Hernan Cortez, the conquistador, Spanish conquistador, who referred to Aztec temples as Moorish mosques, Aztec women as Moorish women, Aztec weapons that were being used as scimitars, which is the Spanish name, as alfanjis, which is the English term for them is scimitars. They're the weapons that Muslims used against the Crusaders. It's sort of like the curved sword that usually has Quranic verses etched on it, right? He even referred to two-spirit people who are gender non-conforming Muslims as birdah, which is this term that was cast onto gender non-conforming Muslims. Of course, that project then, after you engage in the annihilation of over 100 million indigenous people across the continent, then you engaged in slavery, or the white supremacy and the white enlightenment project, if you will, engaged in slavery, and a third and fifth of the transatlantic slaves were Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula on the west coast of Africa. What does Taghut have to do with all this? Well, Taghut is actually a spiritual and an ethical political orientation, just as much as Iman or believing is a spiritual ethical orientation in a different way. The orientation of Taghut is towards the world of the above. I described the world in 1492. Europe was coming out of the Dark Ages. It was beginning to set up plantation economies, slavery economies, right? Capitalism was beginning to thrive. The nation state was beginning to be built. This is what led ultimately to Sykes-Picot and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the splintering of predominantly Arab and Muslim societies, right? And the beginning and the full exacerbated sort of implementation of a Taghuti world, a world completely of the above. Now, I'm not saying that 1,445 years of Muslim history isn't filled with Taghuti mentality and Taghuti acts. Of course, Muslims committed a lot of problems, and it's because Muslims had left the original Ummah and what the Prophet ﷺ instilled and what the original polity instilled, the original Sahaba had instilled, that gradually Muslims started to buy into the world of the above. They started to become empires, right? Now, and injustices were committed. But still, during the medieval or pre-modern period, you can travel. There weren't nation states. There wasn't capitalism. I mean, there were certain dimensions that were different. Was there slavery? Yeah, but it's not the same thing as transatlantic slavery. Slaves weren't fundamental. You don't have plantation economies within so-called the Muslim empire and so on and so forth. So you don't own the slave. All these different manifestations. So we talk about, cross-comparative histories, literature's words. This becomes very important, right? Because some anarchists will say, oh, well, Muhammad doesn't condemn enough, slavery in medieval Muslim societies, and they're no different than transatlantic slavery. It's just like, yeah, because they're not the same. That doesn't mean that I'm not condoning slavery within itself, but you can't compare slavery that white supremacists engaged in with slavery that existed during these times, whether it's within Jewish societies, Muslim societies, et cetera, and the majority of slaves were not actually people of color, they were Circassian. There's a lot of detail there. And slaves could start their own works or businesses. They weren't owned. They could get married. They had a choice. They had upward mobility within society. So it's a very different world than the one that we know today. And again, this is not to condone slavery or modern forms of slavery in the Emirates and indentured servitude and labor, et cetera, right? That exists, migrant slavery and so on. So Taghut manifests in that world of the above. When you think about, even in terms of architecture, look at the mile-high clock tower that exists in Saudi Arabia that overshadows the Kaaba. It's the House of Saud. I mean, this is the irony that that peninsula is called the Arabian Peninsula. It's called the Saudi's Peninsula because it's named after the royal family now, right? But it's Arabia, right?
Yeah.
So it's the world of the above, even in terms of architecture. It's just the Prophet peace be upon him described that one of the signs of the end times is people are building skyscrapers into the sky. Desert nomads are leaving their desert ways and building skyscrapers into sky as if they're going to reach God, pierce the sky, dethrone God, and crown themselves as demagogues in a certain way, right? So
Yeah.
that's the arrogance. That's the Taghut. And of course, the Emiratis and the Saudis, they conscript scholars from societies like Egypt, from Al-Azhar, from South Asia, from America, people like Hamza Youssef and so on and so forth, Charmaine Jackson, etc., who are on their council of elders in order to justify the Abraham Accords and normalizations, because the normalization of the Abraham Accords wasn't just a matter of normalization between countries in the region or states in the region and the Zionist entity and the crusading entity. Rather, it was the death knell of the spiritual, ethical, political moorings of peoples within the region. And this is what made it so dangerous. So this is the Taghut. The Taghut is that exists in ISIS, that exists in Daesh. Because let me say this. This goes back to your previous question in terms of liberalism, words and their meaning. When you ask any Arab or Muslim, what is the word for state? What is the term that they'll say? They'll say dawla. But dawla, we know, and as you know that I write, does not mean state. Dawla or Duwayla actually is the proper pronunciation, is a term or a concept in the Quran whose roots lie between two verbs, zal and dar, to rotate and to go away. But we didn't have a word for state. So when we were conquered, during the time of Sykes-Picot, etc., we took a word that means the opposite of its intended meaning in the Quran and we started using it for state. So the colonization of language, that's also a form of taghut, right? Whether it's those who would like to establish a so-called Islamic state as sort of a jumping point or launch pad towards the Ummah, or those who disagree with the idea that one should have an Ummah. And again, it's understandable because there have only been totalitarian understandings of the Ummah, fascistic understandings of the Ummah, but that's not the original meaning or the original foundation of the Ummah itself. So it's the fear of confronting the internalized Islamophobia from digging deeper. Sovereignty lies within the Ummah, beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Its manifestation on earth is in the Ummah. So how can we have an Ummah of believers, and an Ummah of believers that also includes nations and tribes of non-human life that we're in symbiotic relationship with? So all these questions again require a project, and they require people that are willing to relearn Islam. This is also my critique, I guess. I love Ali Shariati. We have a lot of Muslim leftists, historically speaking, but the problem with that trajectory is that it's still normalized the state. A lot of Muslim Marxists still normalize the state, and they don't want to contend with the Taghut that has to deal with an analysis of power, of how political power functions. That's why we refer to it as political economy. That's why historical materialism is also limited, because it doesn't include the element of spirituality, doesn't include the element of an understanding of power, an analysis of power or political power, that we all covet power on some levels. Yeah. So that's an Taghouti mentality that way, deification that way.
In Communique number 3, you invoke the assassinations of our sons. How do target killings, martyrdom, and collective remembrance form part of the Gaza's theology of steadfastness and revolutionary continuity?
Well, our martyrs are names, they are lives, they are universes, they are worlds. How do we honor? I mean, the same thing with, say, forgive me, I'm going to evoke this not just in Gaza, but the Black Spring. What, there are no George Floyds, Trayvon Martins, Michael Browns, Breonna Taylors now, the Hind Rajabs, the Fadi Al-Fayoums, who was killed in Illinois, stabbed, over 18 times, or between 12 to 18 times, by his neighbor, his white neighbor that used to play with him and make him toys, swing, right? And then Gaza happens, and then, he goes and kills Wadia, not Fadi, Wadia al-Fayoum. Hind Rajab, over close to 300 bullets, as she's crying out for emergency workers and crying for her family to help save her. The element of mass information, the AI world. How do we remember our martyrs? Because again, our martyrs don't die, and they are witnesses now upon us. But that requires a whole different level of responsibility on our part, and the interlinking in not whitewashed ways our struggles. And that's what's key. right now is, if we're serious about Palestine's liberation and we're in Turtle Island, we have to center indigenous people. We have to center indigenous sovereignty. We have to center Black self-determination. We can't say free Palestine while not dealing with Turtle Island. Everybody has to hyphenate their identities. The African American, the Asian American, the Black American, the Arab American, the every American, the Indian American, yet who's the one that doesn't have to hyphenate their name? It's the white man, because they're assumed to be the native of the land. So the lack of taking indigenous struggles seriously, and indigenous sovereignty, if we're serious about, we have to face the bigger monster in the mirror. If we're serious about honoring our martyrs, we have to contend with the martyrs because of the ongoing genocide of indigenous and Black people. What indigenous people don't have the absence of clean water, their suicide rates, their incarceration rates, same with our Black siblings. So this is the irony behind that. But we don't want to deal, because it's easy to point at a monster far away, because that doesn't force us to deal with, again, the monster staring us in the mirror. The only way to honor, again, Gaza is to really deal with the monsters, the Taghuts that we have inside us, to give everything that we have, as our people in Palestine are sacrificing everything. They have given everything. There's nothing that they haven't. They have given their children, their belongings, their homes, and still they remain resilient. What have we given up? Oh, I got doxxed. Oh, okay. That's not a big of a sacrifice. That's the least one can do. That's nothing, actually. That's nothing. Okay, I lost my source of income. Alhamdulillah. I'm fine. So pushing that emblem, the greater jihad. What can I give more? What can I sacrifice more? What can I do more? Be it, again, and there are many forms of jihad, as we noted, be it in terms of knowledge, be it in terms of, because knowledge is just a form of propaganda. Whatever it may be, but we have to start going beyond the minutiae of the petty sacrifices or things that are given up, the trivial things in the name of sacrifice, in the name of getting an extra follower on Twitter or on Facebook or on Instagram or on social media. We need to be able to give our lives. This is a battle of the dunya versus the akhirah, the life, the temporary life versus the real world. And this is why Allah describes the dunya in this world as shahwun wa mata'. It's filled with pleasures, yes. It's filled with beautiful ornaments, yes, of which are children, of which is wealth. But these are part of the seductions in life. And this is a test. Either you are seduced by Taghut and the seductions of life, or you know what this world is actually about. And this is where we look to our mujahideen and our people in Gaza. That's the only way we honor them.
Yeah. Returning to the question of Iran, you spoke a little bit about how this is a critical moment in sort of shifting and possibly shifting towards an Islam from below. But I wanted to get your perspective on Foucault's analysis from 1979, Iranian Revolution as a form of spiritual political insurrection, and how that was critiqued by both liberal and left scholars, right, at the time. And seeing your perspective in terms of that, does your critique of Taghut and the embrace of Islam of the below complicate or extend Foucault's reading?
I think it definitely extends while dealing with his Orientalism at the same time.
Yeah.
What he referred to as political spirituality, which is really, again, Malcolm's project, right? I mean, again, any idea is inherently political. This is the irony behind the term Islamist. That's such an Orientalist term, right?
Yeah.
Political Islam. That's what Judaism is not political. Christianity is not political. Like, any idea is political. Hinduism is any idea is political. The question is, what sort of ethical, political, spiritual praxis or responsibilities is it anchored in? That becomes the question. So I'm out to deal with this question of political spirituality. And of course, liberals and progressives that have critiqued Foucault are critiquing him on the one hand that he's not critical enough of Iran, which is valid, but are also critical of him because he actually values something in Islam and its revolutionary potential. And that's what he's tapping into. It's just that Foucault is not a Muslim, and it's not his project to develop a Quran of the oppressed, our Quran of the resistance. That's left to somebody like me, because you have to develop that from a theological perspective, right? This is why I even deal with the Quran explicitly so, right? This is not to say that I ignore the Sunnah or Shiite or oral traditions, or that I don't value Sufism or Ismaili. I center the Quran because whether you're a nation of Islam or any of the 73 something denominations of Islam, the Quran is the one book that you are beholden to as an Ahmadi, as an Ismaili, as whatever. So my judgment of you, this is why I don't even call myself a Sunni Muslim. I was taught the Quran by a Shiite Muslim who was over 100 years old. His name was Sheikh Jilani. And I didn't even know he was a Shiite up until he passed away during my first year of engineering. My point being is that I don't identify with a particular sect because my barometer, my engagement with regards to myself, my measuring yardstick with regards to others, as well as myself, is the Quran, right? And again, things have to be started with a particular foundation. When Prophet ﷺ was conveying the message, he spent 10 years working on Aqidat al-Tawheed, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Why? Because if you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you don't deify a nation, you don't deify a state, you don't worship your mother, your father, you don't worship your children, you don't worship wealth, you don't worship. So 10 years to institute that. And then after that, the forbiddance of drinking. And then after that, debates about this or that. These, I'm not trying to take away from the branches of the tree, but where's the trunk? So this is what becomes, we've left the trunk, the social justice pillars, right? Muslims were committing femicide. So the transformation, the trunk of the tree needs to be there. Arabs were committing femicide during because that was part of their culture. They would bury their women alive. The trunk of the tree needs to be there. To get entangled in the hijab, the not hijab, these are, again, I'm not trying to make light of these debates, but there's just very debates. These are the branches of the tree. That's not the trunk. Because you could be wearing a hijab and engaged in haya. You could not be wearing a hijab and be engaged in haya too, and modesty, and men need to engage in modesty too. So what are we talking about here, right? When we talk about issues of sexuality, then we need to talk about and same-sex practicing. This is why I don't buy into LGBTIQ categories. Those are Western imperatives, and that's homo-nationalism and the weaponization of sexuality as an identity politics. Who says that anybody should know what a person does in their bedroom? There's an element of khususiyat or privacy, right? Versus umumiyat, right? But look at the kind of pedantic debates that we're engaged in that are decontextualized from history, that are unmoored from the foundations of Islam. So again, going back to the Foucault question, political spirituality is fundamental because any idea, Marxism is not a religion, it has become a religion, anarchism has become a religion. Any idea is endowed with spirit. How else is it supposed to garner believers, let alone people ready to die for that idea? So he was onto something, and there will be, and there is no force in the world more powerful than religion, or than faith, or that spirituality. There is none. Because it's an idea that rests on a higher power, a higher cosmology of life, that I'm willing to die, not for Marx, but for the land or some creator. That kind of a manifestation, regardless of what we call creator. Islam acknowledges over 200 to 300,000 different prophets that were sent to different tribes and nations. Created you from different tribes and nations so you may get to know one another. And the best amongst you is what? Those who exercise taqwa, piety. What is piety anchored in? Spiritual, ethical, political commitments. So this is where, again, give me Moses who stood before Pharaoh. Give me the Judaism of Moses that stood before Pharaoh. Give me Isa who stood in defense of Mary Magdalene, who flipped the money inside the temple while priests were engaging in riba, engaging in interest, which is an exploitation of the poor. Give me Muhammad who stood for the oppressed. We all know Islam is anti-capitalist unless you're Erdogan and think that Islam is compatible with capitalism. But where is the forbiddance of riba? It's the foundation to capitalism, right? And without riba, then capitalism falls. So there are many different factors. What about the idea of khulafa? We're all caretakers. Why do you need a single khalifa? You have the idea of shura, which is community consensus, maslaha, public welfare, ijma', community consensus, shura is mutual consultation, So look at all these non-authoritarian commitments, not just anti-authoritarian, because if I say I'm anti-capitalist, okay, what are the non-capitalist principles? What are the non-authoritarian versus anti-authoritarianism is polemic, anti-capitalism is polemic. But if I say non-authoritarian, non-capitalist, that means I've went to my traditions culturally, spiritually, and I've extracted concepts and practices that are non-capitalist and are non-authoritarian that help form the foundation of an alternative Islamic economy, a foundation to a non-authoritarian Islam that will never feed into a world of the above. This is how, again, Muslims just misunderstand a lot of things. Oh, let's establish an Islamic State. Oh, let's establish a caliphate. Caliphate is not a political, it did not exist during the time of the Prophet. The Prophet founded an Ummah. The caliphate is a prophetic model that forms after the Prophet's death and actually after the Khulafa Rashidin die. Umar wasn't just Umar on his own. Ali wasn't just Ali on his own. Abu Bakr wasn't just Abu Bakr on his own. Uthman were. This is why 3 of the 4 leaders were assassinated too, because they weren't sitting down in palaces. They didn't go around with bodyguards defending them. They didn't establish a hierarchical order. They were in each other's counsel. And you know what? If they wronged, the Ummah was there to correct them. So this is how Aisha could meet Ali on the battlefield and challenge him in the Battle of the Camel, because power was fluid and every Muslim was engaged in jihad, and their loyalty wasn't to Ali and loyalty wasn't to Aisha or Abu Bakr. Loyalty was to principles defined by Allah and the Quran.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. You also write in your book, anarchism must be spiritualized and Islam must be destatized. How is this vision reconciled with movements such as, Palestinian solidarity movement or otherwise different movements that are taking place, where the demand for statehood remains central to national liberation?
Well, that's not sure. First of all, it's a brilliant question. The encampments were an example of, because there were no leaders in the encampments. Muhammad was not a leader. Mahmoud was somebody who relayed messages between those in the encampments and Columbia University. That's it. He was a messenger. I'm not meaning to make light of that, but the encampments weren't made for leadership. You have many examples of Muslim anarchists in the Bay Area, in other places across the U.S. The question isn't that. The question is, how do we become a living embodiment of what was built in Gaza, right? Because what is built in Gaza is organic. Communities taking part and families taking part of one another. There isn't who's the leader right now. There is no leader right now. And it doesn't matter. And it makes it easy because, in a certain sense, Sinwar, the general, is gone, may he rest in power. Daif is gone, may he rest in power. Mohammed Sinwar is that he rest in power. The idea is impossible to kill. You can kill, but when you have 1,000 seeds, it becomes much more difficult to decapitate, because you're the inverted root of a tree. You have no center. You're a rhizome. You can't be killed, because the idea just keeps on growing and spreading sideways and so on. And this is how Hamas could be able to re-recruit the same number of mujahideen, 10,000 mujahideen that were martyred since its operations of October, maybe even more. So this is the strength. And of course, look, there's always going to be differences in power. I can't sit down and say that, as somebody who's joining Hamas today, that there isn't and as a mujahid today, that I would be different than Abu Ubaidah. Of course, there's a difference there. Abu Ubaidah, but Abu Ubaidah is seasoned as a speaker for Hamas. He's seasoned in terms of his jihad. When we sit together, we're eating the same food. We're caring for one another. We're in the same tunnels. So there's always going to be, and we need to also understand that, of course, there has to be a little bit of, I don't want to say hierarchies, because they're not institutionalized hierarchies, but differences in power within militant movements, because some people have more experience than others. But as a leader, you share that power. As a leader, you engage in shura, you engage in mutual consultation, and you don't think of yourself as any or more or better or different than other mujahideen. Again, Sinwar was on the ground. He wasn't surrounded. He had 2 other mujahideen with him who were also assassinated. He wasn't walking around with bodyguards. The same thing with Commander Al-Daif, who was assassinated in Khan Yunis, a refugee camp where he was born. So this is the kind of, again, selflessness, of modesty, this was a general commander. He's not hiding. He's not surrounded by bodyguards. So I think the element of going back to movements, of people understanding, especially on Turtle Island, the importance of spirituality, the importance of secrecy, the importance of organizing, of going underground, of building. It took 10 years for the Zapatistas to build what they built in La Condana jungle. 10 years, and then they appeared at the scene. The Panthers, the same. They didn't just pick up arms. No, they built alternatives. Because then you even have more of a capacity for people to be attracted to your idea, because you're giving them an alternative way of living, an alternative way of seeing the world, right? Picking up arms is actually easy.
Yeah, I think this relates to something you wrote in the Communique number 3, which describes tunnels as classrooms, clinics, prayer halls, sanctuaries of life beneath the rubble of death. Can you elaborate on these as more than, say, a military infrastructure and what they teach us?
Well, can we imagine? I mean, there are 600 kilometers of subterranean tunnels underground, and the Zionist entity expected that the Mujahideen, if and should they attack, they will attack from above ground. But the Mujahideen had been building these tunnels, some of which go back to the 80s, right? And sharing their experiences amongst one another. Hezbollah sharing its experiences with Ansarullah, with the Mujahideen. And again, somebody like Qasem Soleimani was instrumental to all this tunnel build. And they weren't building the tunnels with, big caterpillar bulldozers. They were digging them with rudimentary material, with their own hands, with shovels. And in a way, again, if we've been disconnected from land, what better way than to get to know the land that way? 200,000 cement pieces used to form these tunnels, right? And they're spaces of sanctuary where our birds of prey, where the Mujahideen who flew over the wall vis-a-vis the parachute gliders, which was a miraculous story within itself, as you know, that I wrote about at Communique number 3, right? This was all organized through the tunnels. You have to build a place of sanctuary. But again, it's in relationship to land, and our Mujahideen got to know land. They had, again, classrooms there, as you noted. They have access to things. They produce their own weapons. Their own tourniquets. They don't buy tourniquets from China and America for $50. They learned how to make them for $2, $3 with their own hands. They got samples, and they're just like, okay, how can we make tourniquets like this to stop Mujahideen from bleeding or dying from bleeding when they got injured in the battlefields? So it's a world of alternatives. It's a universe. And only they know it. These 600 kilometers, and they built another 600 kilometers since the Al-Aqsa flood. So they haven't stopped building. They built even more tunnels. This is subhanAllah, like, look at the strength, look at the faith in the midst of war that you're still able to build tunnels. And they have no center. You can enter from one point, exit from a zillion different points. Nobody has a roadmap to them, etc. And that's okay. Nobody has the full blueprint, save for a few. But yeah, you're able to manufacture your own weapons, down to the bullets, your drones, your whole snipers, like your bombs, absolutely everything. So this is part of, again, the magnanimity that what our Mujahideen built. If only we can build something. Instead of us taking to the streets, let's galvanize our resources. Let's go buy a piece of land, rematriate it to indigenous people in the context of Turtle Island. Let's learn how to farm. It's so easy to say down with capitalism, it's all falling. Okay, when it collapses, who's it going to collapse on? On all of us. It's just like, okay, you hate on capitalism, but do you know how to grow your own food to feed yourself, let alone your family, let alone your community? Then what are you so euphoric about? Because when it collapses, but if I learn to grow my own food and can support my community, I don't need to shop at Wegmans or go to the supermarket to buy my fruits and vegetables anymore. I've divested from the state. When I no longer vote, I've divested. Why aren't we doing more of that? But as the Quran says, وَكَمْ مِنْ فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةٍ كَثِيرَةٍ, only a small group. This is the problem with mass mobilizations and the fantasy that big movements are going to change the world. They're not. They don't often do. Tahrir didn't. The civil rights didn't. Movement. They don't. They never do. It's people with a vision, an alternative way of life. And our Mujahideen offer us a blueprint.
Well, that's a very important